I first heard the name Willow Gorge on a Tuesday in October 1984, in a windowless room that smelled like wet paper and tired fluorescent lights. On the shelves around me, a century of other people's lives sat in gray Hollinger boxes, each one labeled in my own cramped handwriting. Town Council Minutes 1921-1929. Ashfield Gazette Photographs Negatives. County Coroner's Reports 1950-1959. I'd been at the county archive 3 months, and already my days were starting to blur. You process 100 stacks of brittle school board minutes, and you start to feel like time isn't a straight line, just the same arguments stamped over different dates. I was halfway through rehousing a run of moldy church registers when my supervisor stuck her head around the door. "Dan," she said, "delivery for you. From Virginia, I think. Nobody ever sent anything for me." They sent it for the archive, and I happened to be the one with the least seniority and the strongest back. I set down the ledger carefully. The covers were so loose they felt like they might come off in my hands, and wiped my palms on my jeans. "In the loading bay?" I asked. "In my office," Linda said. "Donor insisted someone proper receive it. He's particular." She hesitated on that last word in a way that made me sigh inwardly. Particular meant some old guy who'd watched too many courtroom dramas and thought archives worked like TV. I followed her down the narrow hall, past the copy room and the staff lockers, into the shoebox that passed for the director's office. The man waiting there took up less space than his presence did. He was maybe 60, tall but stooped a little, in a long wool coat that looked like it had seen better winters. His hair was iron gray, slicked back with more care than success. He held a fedora in his hands and was turning it slowly, over and over, the way some people roll a cigarette between their fingers when they're trying to keep them busy. On the visitor's chair beside him sat 3 archival cartons, the kind we used, but older, edges worn, labels yellowed, a darker gray than ours. Somebody had tied them together with twine, a neat, tight cross. "Mr. Parker," Linda said, gesturing toward me, "this is Dan Walsh, our processing archivist. He'll be handling your materials." The man's eyes cut to me. They were pale blue, almost washed out, but there was nothing weak about the way they settled on my face. He took me in the way a surveyor looks at a field, quickly, completely, without much emotion. "You from around here, Mr. Walsh?" he asked. "Up the road in Harrow," I said. "Parents still there," he grunted. "Scots-Irish stock, then?" "Mostly," I said, not sure where this was going. "That's good," he said cryptically. "Your people know what it means to carry something a long way and not talk about it." He set the fedora on his knee and patted the boxes. "These have been carried long enough." Linda shot me a quick, warning glance that said, "Don't start arguing with the donor." I nodded at the cartons instead. "You're donating a family collection?" I asked, slipping into the soothing script they'd taught us in grad school. "We really appreciate the trust. We'll make sure it's preserved, and of course we can restrict sensitive materials if—" "No restrictions," he cut in sharply. "That's the point. All this time we hid it, locked it up, boxed it, moved it from attic to attic. Seemed like the only way to keep the house quiet." "The house," I repeated. He looked at me like he'd already judged my intelligence and found it mixed. "Willow Gorge," he said. "That's what it's called now, at least in the papers. The original name," he trailed off, shook his head. "Doesn't matter, the land still knows." I opened my mouth to ask something, what land, where, but Linda stepped in smoothly. "Maybe you could tell us a little about the collection," she said. "The scope, dates, that sort of thing." He drew in a breath, let it out slow. 1884 to 1984, he said. "Every generation someone put something in. Letters, photographs, journals, newspaper clippings, hospital records, some other things. We called it the Willow Gorge Archive." Said the last 3 words like they were capitalized in his head, like a proper noun. 100 years, I said. "That's significant." He gave a dry smile. "Significant is one word for it." Linda gestured toward the boxes. "Why us?" she asked. "If the materials relate to Virginia, have you considered—" "Virginia doesn't want it," he said flatly. "They took a look at the finding aid my uncle drafted and politely suggested it might be better housed closer to the family." His mouth twisted. "Closer, but not too close. This town's far enough that if something wakes up, it won't be their problem." Linda blinked. She wasn't easily rattled. We'd had people donate everything from Grandma's clan robes to jars of formaldehyde pickled things, but this had clearly come preloaded with a story. "I'll leave you and Dan to go through the paperwork," she said with a professional smile. "If you sign the deed of gift, we can accession the collection today." He signed. His hand shook only a little. Later, after he'd gone and the ink on the forms was dry, I found myself alone in the processing room with the 3 boxes. The windowless cinderblock walls made the fluorescent light feel harsher than usual. The hum from the big dehumidifier in the corner was the only sound. On the outside of the top carton, in brown ink that had feathered with age, someone had written, "Willow Gorge Family Archive Box 1 of 3 1884-1909." Below that, in a different hand, stronger, more recent, 2 words, "Do not open." I stared at that instruction for a good 10 seconds. You work in archives long enough, you see that kind of melodrama occasionally. Old diaries with "destroy upon my death" on the flyleaf, letters labeled "for my sons EYES only." 9 times out of 10, when you open them, it's petty family gossip and bad poetry. Still, someone 8-9 decades ago had cared enough to scrawl that warning on a box they then carefully kept and moved and tied. I sliced through the twine with my utility knife. The lid came off with a soft, sticky sound like something reluctantly letting go. The smell hit me first. Old paper has a scent we all know, musty, a little sweet. This was sharper, almost metallic. Like a mix of rust and mold and the inside of a long-forgotten trunk in a damp attic. I sneezed, stepped back, then leaned in again slowly. On top, someone had laid a sheet of stiff, yellowed paper, typed unevenly on an old machine. An inventory. Willow Gorge Archive Box 1, 1884-1909. Beneath that, in 2 columns, was a list. Ledger Book Ezekiel Harrow, 1884-1887, Personal Diary Margaret Harrow, 1884-1889, Correspondence Dr. W. J. Fenwick to E. Harrow, Assorted, 1884-1885, Newspaper Clippings Willow Gorge Disaster, Assorted, 1884-1886, Photograph Album Harrow Family, 1879-1890, Small Journal Unlabeled, Barn Loft, 1885, County Coroner's Inquest Harrow vs. Commonwealth, 1885, Copy Misc, Ephemera Funeral Cards, Church Bulletins, Invitations. I felt a little shiver work its way up my spine. Harrow. I told Parker I was from Harrow. It was the name of the town up the road where my parents still lived in the same 2-story they'd bought in '62. We had Harrow Baptist, Harrow High, Harrow Hardware. Nobody ever talked about where the name came from. I'd never thought to ask. I lifted the first item out of the box. The ledger was a heavy thing, bound in cracked leather gone almost black with age. The spine complained when I opened it but held. On the inside cover, in looping penmanship, someone had written, "Accounts Ledger Ezekiel T. Harrow, Willow Gorge, Virginia, January 1, 1884." Below that, in smaller, tighter script, "Let there be light in the gorge, and let it cover what has been done." The hairs on my arms prickled. Archivists aren't supposed to get superstitious about their collections. We're supposed to be neutral, dispassionate. If anything, skeptical. We've all seen family legends crumble under the weight of a census record that says Grandpa was in jail, not off fighting the good fight. But something about that line in that actual 19th century ink felt less like a biblical misquote and more like a muttered prayer. Let it cover what has been done. I flipped past the front matter. The next several pages were what you'd expect in a ledger. Neat rows of numbers, names, dates, descriptions. Hire of laborers, purchase of lumber, wages paid to a mason, shipments received. Willow Gorge had been a lumber operation I remembered vaguely. There was an old mill town out that way, abandoned now. Teenagers dared each other to drive out there on weekends, someone had told me, at a bar, a place you could see stars and not much else. On a whim, I skipped ahead. July 3, 1884. Paid $70 to J. Mullins & Sons, blasting powder, caps, fuses. July 7, 1884. Paid $35 to G. Ransom, labor, clearing ledge, setting charges. July 9, 1884. Received $120 county appropriation for improvement of Gorge Road, blasting powder. I suppressed a smile. Archivist, not detective, I reminded myself. Still, patterns were patterns. I turned one more page. Between the neat columns of numbers in a different ink, someone had scrawled across the margin, July 14, 1884 stop. The handwriting was shakier here. A little ink had splattered at the end of the word like the pen had hesitated then jerked. I was leaning closer, trying to make out a faint line below it. Was that too many? Already done, when the overhead lights flickered. It was just a quick blink. Off on. The sort of thing that happens in old buildings when the air conditioner kicks in and the circuits stutter. Still, my stomach clenched. Great, I muttered. That's what we need, power issues on top of everything else. The dehumidifier hummed along unbothered. I set the ledger gently aside and reached for the diary. Margaret Harrow's journal was smaller, the kind of book you could slip into an apron pocket. The cover had once been red, now it had faded to a sickly pink. A brass clasp, long since broken, dangled from a strip of leather. I opened to the first page. January 4, 1884. It is not proper for a woman to keep a diary, or so my mother informed me the first and last time she found the little book in which I wrote down my thoughts as a girl. Idle minds breed idle notions, she said, and I saw the hint of true fear in her eyes as she held the pages over the kitchen fire. I am not sure if Ezekiel will approve of this new attempt, but I find I cannot bear to have the things we are seeing and doing go unrecorded. Somebody should remember. The script was careful, with just enough blotting to suggest she'd been more familiar with needle and thread than pen and ink. My throat tightened around nothing. I'd catalogued 100 diaries by then. World War I soldiers in clumsy field notebooks, farmwives in pencil on the backs of seed catalogs, lonely teenagers scrawling in pink lockable journals with private embossed on the front. They all started the same way. Some version of I don't know why I'm doing this, but... The next line in Margaret's book was an exception. It is January and the Gorge is screaming again. I read it twice. The Gorge is screaming. Outside the processing room, a cart rattled down the hall, one of the student workers heading to the stacks. The mundane sound anchored me just enough that I could breathe again. I turned the page. January 4, 1884 continued. The men say it is only the wind, that the cold makes the rock contract and the sound echoes through the trees. They say the same thing every winter, and every winter the sound gets worse. It sets the dogs howling and the cattle lowing, and even the children cease their play to stand and listen, eyes wide. Last night, little Thomas woke twice, sobbing, "Mama, make it stop." I told him it was just the wind because that is what I had been told and because there is nothing else I know how to say. Today Ezekiel rode into town to speak with Dr. Fenwick and the county commissioners. There was a meeting at the courthouse. Men went in looking worried and came out looking something else. Determined. Hard, I wish I could have been a mouse in that room. But wives are not allowed in such conversations. Something about the phrase, "the gorge is screaming," made a cold little knot form under my sternum. I flipped ahead. January 10, 1884. Ezekiel tells me the county is planning an improvement to Willow Gorge Road. There is to be blasting to widen the path where it narrows along the cliff. It will create work for the men and make the passage safer, or so they say. Something in his face when he spoke those words made my blood run cold. I asked him, "Will it stop the sound?" He would not look at me when he answered. "We pray it will," he said. The ledger entries matched: blasting powder, labor, the screaming gorge. A childhood memory stirred in me then, unbidden. I was 8 or 9, riding in the back of my dad's pickup down Route 27. The road cut along a ravine out past town, a place with no guardrails and too many memorial crosses on the shoulder. It had been raining. The asphalt shone black. As we rounded a bend, Dad had nodded toward a narrow gravel turnoff that led into the trees. "That used to go all the way down to Willow Gorge," he'd said. "Back before the flood took out the bridge. People say if you go down there at night you can hear things." I'd pressed my face to the glass, trying to see past the wet streaks. All I'd caught was a glimpse of gray rock and a fallen road closed sign. "What kind of things?" ID asked. He'd grunted. "Teenagers mostly." Then after a beat, "And before that, accidents, landslides, work crews, stupid decisions on wet roads. Your mom doesn't like me talking about it." He hadn't said anything about screaming. The overhead lights hummed softly as if nothing had changed. I realized my palms were damp. On reflex, I glanced at the clock on the wall. 4. 37 p.m. In 23 minutes, the building would close and I'd have to put everything back in its box for the night. 10 years earlier, I might have snuck a folder home, hungry to keep reading. Now, the thought of carrying any of this out into my little apartment made the skin between my shoulder blades itch. I forced myself to turn one more page. January 16, 1884. They have begun. The first charges went off this afternoon. I heard the boom all the way from the house, though Ezekiel told me it would be no louder than thunder. The windows rattled in their frames. Thomas clapped his hands over his ears and baby Eliza started up a terrible wail. A haze of dust rose over the gorge, visible even from here, a sickly yellow-brown cloud that hung in the trees. For a moment the screaming ceased. Not because it was truly gone, I think, but because the sound of the explosion drowned it. Tonight, as the men came up from the worksite in a weary, shouting line, I saw something in their faces I did not like. Not pride, not relief. Something like men who had struck at a wild animal and were waiting to see if it would roll over and die, or get back up angrier than before. My husband would say I am being fanciful, that I should attend to my sowing and leave the work of the land to those who understand it. But part of me wonders if the earth itself can be offended. I jumped when a voice spoke behind me. "You okay in here, Dan?" I turned so fast my chair squeaked. It was Derek, one of the student assistants, clutching a stack of unfiled microfilm reels. "Yeah," I said a little too quickly, "just deep in 1884, what's up?" "Linda says 10 minutes till closing," he said. "Wants to know if you're gonna need the cart left out." "Tell her I'll load this stuff back myself," I said, glancing at the open box. "Not much point wheeling it across the hall," he nodded. "Smells funky in here today." "Old paper," I said automatically. He wrinkled his nose. "Smells like the basement of my grandma's place. Before they demoed it, I mean, like wet rock, you know." He headed out without waiting for an answer. Wet rock. I looked down at the diary. January 20, 1884. It has been 4 days since the blasting began. Already something is wrong. The men found the first body today. I felt my heartbeat stutter, then thud faster. We had been told the worksite would be safe. That Dr. Fenwick had surveyed the gorge and declared the rock sound. He spoke at church of modern engineering, of man's God-given duty to tame the wild places. This afternoon, one of the ledges gave way. They found Samuel Pritchard at the bottom of the ravine, his head split like a melon. Ezekiel came home with blood on his cuffs and would not meet my eyes. At supper, he announced that the men will continue tomorrow. When I asked if there would be any change to their methods, he snapped that I had been listening too much to the wailing of the wives and not enough to the realities of progress. "Samuel knew the risk," he said. "We all do, we cannot stop now." Later, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, I heard him in his study, retching. "The gorge has begun its answer." I closed the book gently. My own hands were shaking now, just a little. Enough that I could see the tremor in my fingers when I reached for the file of newspaper clippings. Standard practice would have been to stop, make a note of where I'd left off, rebox the materials, go home, eat something, turn on the TV, let myself think about my own life for a few hours. That was the healthy boundary we were supposed to have. Instead, I slid the packet of old newsprint out of its folder. The first clipping was from the Willow Gorge Gazette, July 18, 1884. Tragic accident in the gorge, 1 dead, 3 injured as road improvement work continues. I scanned the column. The language was what you'd expect. Enterprising, unfortunate, heroic efforts. The dead man's name, Samuel Pritchard, was there, and a quote from County Commissioner Ezekiel Harrow about the necessity of pressing on in the face of adversity. At the bottom, a short line. The sound that has long haunted this stretch of the gorge was notably absent in the hours following the accident. Absent. I flipped to the next clipping. August 3, 1884. Another loss at Willow Gorge. Local girl falls from ledge. My stomach clenched. The victim this time was not one of the workers, but a 10-year-old girl, Charity Mullins, who had slipped away from her mother's watchful gaze during a Sunday school picnic near the gorge rim. The paper described at morbid length how her body had been recovered halfway down the cliffside, caught in a tangle of mountain laurel. "It is this reporter's opinion," the author wrote, "that the Almighty is sending a clear message regarding man's attempt to interfere with his handiwork in the gorge. At the bottom, someone, probably Margaret, had underlined that sentence in faint pencil. The inventory said the box went up to 1909. I didn't have the hours left in the day to crawl through 25 years of whatever this was. Reluctantly, I reassembled the layers. Diary, ledger clippings, tied back bundles of letters with brittle twine. I set Margaret's journal atop the rest, closed the lid, and slid the carton back onto the shelf beneath the work table. When I straightened, my back twinged. Desk work sounds sedate until you've sat hunched over a 100-year-old ledger for 3 hours. As I shut off the light, the room fell briefly, utterly black. The emergency exit sign over the door glowed a dull red rectangle. From somewhere deep in the stacks, metal creaked. Just the building settling, I told myself. Just air in the ducts. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I locked the processing room door out of habit and stepped into the corridor. The fluorescent tubes hummed. The air tasted faintly of coffee from the staff kitchen and of cold outside. The archive always seemed to breathe the weather in through some unseen vent. By the time I hit the parking lot, the last of the sun had slid behind the low hills. October had a way of making the sky look closer, like you could reach up and touch the bruise-colored underside of the clouds. My old Honda hatchback started on the second try. The radio crackled to life, halfway through a Springsteen song. I turned it up louder than necessary. On the drive back to my apartment, I passed the turnoff my father had pointed to all those years ago. The narrow gravel spur that led into the trees. Road closed, the sign at the edge said, in reflective white letters. Somebody had shot it a few times over the years. The buckshot scars froze in my headlights for a moment, white on rust. I resisted the stupid, sudden urge to turn down that road, to see if the bridge was really out, to see if the gorge really screamed. "Don't be an idiot," I muttered. "You're not 16. At home, I heated a can of soup and stared at the TV without seeing it. The evening news anchor's mouth moved, but all I could hear, faint under the bland studio chatter, was Margaret's line. "The gorge is screaming again." I told myself it was just a story, that in 100 years every town collects a few. Coal mine cave-ins that turn into cursed mountains, influenza outbreaks that become the year the Reaper walked Main Street. Still, when I finally caved and went to bed, sleep came in fits. Every time I drifted off, I found myself standing on the edge of something dark and deep, hearing a sound that was almost wind and almost human. I woke twice with my heart hammering and my throat dry. The digital clock glowed 2:17, then 3:43. At 4:39 a.m. I gave up, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with the deed of gift Parker had signed. Donor, Nathaniel P. Parker III collection title, Willow Gorge Family Archive dates, 1884-1984 extent, 3 linear feet subjects, Harrow family Willow Gorge Va. Industrial accidents, local folklore, mental illness, suicide, flooding, death, social aspects, religion, community response to disaster. Linda had scrawled that last line in after a quick skim of the finding aid. Her notes in the margin, though, were the ones that caught my eye in the sleepless dark. Tain's multiple references to the sound in the gorge. Repeated incidents of death at 17, check. Box 3 audio tapes. I stared at that last line until the caffeine kicked my heart rate up another notch. Audio tapes. The paper said the Willow Gorge disaster was in 1884. The family archive went in 1984. Sometime in the intervening century, somebody had sat down with a tape recorder and tried to add their voice to the story. And they'd put those tapes in box 3. All at once, 3 cartons in a windowless room felt like a much heavier burden than they had yesterday morning. The archive opens at 9:00 a.m. 6 days a week. I was there at 8:15, sipping terrible vending machine coffee in the staff kitchen and pretending I wasn't watching the clock. "I know that look," Linda said, coming in with her own mug. "What box has you up early?" "Parker S.," I admitted. "Willow Gorge. I just skimmed the first diary and I've already got a bad feeling." "Bad as in we're going to get sued by a living relative?" she asked. "Or bad as in you're going to need to burn sage in the stacks?" "Somewhere between," I said. She gave a wry half-smile. "You'll get used to it. Every collection feels cursed when you first open it. There's something about seeing that much of one family's grief piled up in acid-free folders." I hesitated. "Did you see the note about audio tapes?" "Yeah. She blew on her coffee. That threw me. I didn't see them in the accession, though. Maybe Parker still has them. They're in box 3, I said. He wrote it on the preliminary inventory, she frowned. Did he? I must have missed that. All right, but take it one box at a time. Finish basic processing on the first before you go listening to ghost stories from the last. Right, I said. One box at a time. 1 year at a time. One death at a time. When the clock finally ticked over to 9:00 and the student workers unlocked the public reading room, I went straight back to the processing room and hauled box 1 onto the table again. As I lifted the lid, the lights overhead flickered. Off, on. This time it wasn't just a blink. It was a long, slow dimming, like someone had turned a rheostat knob halfway down and then, after a beat, back up. In the sudden, brief gloom, the open diary page seemed to glow a little. I told myself it was my imagination, that the ballast in those fixtures had been dying for months and Linda had a work order in with maintenance. Still, as I settled into my chair and picked up where I'd left off, a phrase from Margaret's January entry floated back up. Somebody should remember. The trouble with remembering, I thought, is that sometimes the past isn't content to sit on the page. Sometimes it looks up. Sometimes it starts to scream again. And there I was, in 1984, with my pen and my processing forms and my training in neutral description, about to spend the next however many months stitching together 100 years of one family's darkness. They called it the Willow Gorge Archive. Parker had carried it across state lines to get it away from the land that birthed it. I was the idiot who just cut the string. The second day I went back into the Willow Gorge papers. The air in the processing room felt thicker, like the humidity had crept up overnight even though the dehumidifier hummed along dutifully in the corner. I told myself it was just me. Too little sleep, too much coffee, too many old ghosts crowding into one small windowless space. Box 1 sat where I'd left it, the cardboard a shade darker than the fresh cartons on the shelf above, as if 100 years of other people's hands had seeped into it. I lifted the lid. The faint metallic smell puffed out again, sharper this time. Old dust, rust, something like river rock left in a bucket too long. I set Margaret Harrow's diary in front of me and found the ribbon I'd stuck between the pages. January 20, 1884, the first body in the gorge. I turned the page. January 29, 1884. The sound returned tonight. I had hoped foolishly that the blasting had silenced it, that the earth's protest had been drowned in the noise of our hammers and powder. Instead, it came back louder. We were at table when it began. Ezekiel was speaking of fence repairs. Eliza was banging her spoon against her cup. Then, from the direction of the gorge, there arose a howl that set the glassware trembling in the cupboard. It was like no wind I have ever heard. Began deep, a low moan that might have been the first rumble of thunder. Then it rose and rose again until it seemed to scrape along the inside of my skull. Thomas put his hands over his ears and crawled under the table. Eliza screamed. The dog began to bark, then whimper, then scratch to be let out as if he would rather be in the night with that sound than trapped inside with us. Ezekiel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For a moment, just the one, I saw fear in his eyes. Then his face hardened. "Enough," he said, as if he were addressing an unruly child. He pushed back his chair so hard it tipped and strode to the door. He went out onto the porch. I followed him, though he told me to stay inside. The sound washed over us, coming in waves. It seemed to rise from the very rock from the black slit of the gorge. The trees on the rim bent, though there was no wind. "It's just air," Ezekiel said through his teeth. "Air in a narrow space, like blowing in a bottle, only louder." He shouted then, voice raw. "Stop it, you'll frighten the men and they'll walk off the job." I don't know who he thought he was talking to. The gorge did not listen. I read that last line twice. It was the sort of thing a woman writes when she's half mocking her husband and half praying he's right. The fluorescent light above my table flickered, just once. A quick, almost apologetic blink. I kept reading. February 3, 1884. Dr. Fenwick was here to supper this evening. He came at Ezekiel's invitation to set Margaret's mind at ease on the subject of the blasting. I did not ask for such reassurance, but men in this county are fond of solving problems their wives have not voiced. He is a learned man, by all accounts. He studied engineering at some institute in the north before returning to take up medicine here. The younger ladies in town seemed to find his spectacles and his slightly stooped shoulders charming. I am undecided. He ate Mama's pot roast and drank Ezekiel's good whiskey, and then held forth about strata and fault lines and the value of rational thinking in the face of superstitious whispers. Yes, there was a slip, he said, when I could no longer hold my tongue and asked about Mr. Pritchard's death. All the ledges in that section are undercut. It was a risk, we knew that, but the risk can be managed. We mark the worst cracks now. We keep the men back from the edges during blasting. And the noise? I asked. The sound. You heard it when you arrived, did you not? We could scarcely hear ourselves talk over it. He smiled then, thin and dry. Of course I heard it, Mrs. Harrow, he said. I have heard it every winter since I was a boy. It is nothing more than wind forced through a constriction in the rock. The same principle my physics master used to show us in his laboratory with whistles and glass tubes. It is impressive, I'll grant you that, but not unnatural. If it is so natural, I said before I could stop myself, why has no one heard such a noise in any other gorge in this county, in this state? I have cousins in the Shenandoah, they say their cliffs are as quiet as sleeping cats. Margaret, Ezekiel warned. Fenwick's smile tightened. Not all places are alike, he said. Your gorge is narrow, Mrs. Harrow, deep. The rock is of a different composition. Sandstone, not granite. There may be cavities beneath that amplify any movement. The blasting will widen it, smooth the flow of air. It will change the acoustics just as surely as adding pews alters the sound in a church. Give it time. His tone was patient. To his credit, he did not quite speak as one speaks to a child, but his eyes, when they met mine over the rim of his glass, held something else, something like calculation. I had the unsettling sense that he was as interested in the screaming as I was afraid of it. Perhaps that was unfair. Perhaps I see monsters now in every shadow. Still, tonight as I sit here by candlelight, I cannot shake the feeling that we have hired a man to fix our problem who first wishes to understand it, and that understanding may come at a cost we do not yet grasp. I pulled a folder of Fenwick's letters next. His handwriting was neat, with a slight rightward slant, the paper thick and good. Most were addressed to Ezekiel, a few to the county commissioners jointly. February 10, 1884. Dear Ezekiel, per our discussion at the courthouse last Wednesday, I have had occasion to review the surveyor's notes and to revisit the gorge myself. I remain of the opinion that the blasting can proceed with acceptable risk if we adhere strictly to the following recommendations. The next page was all measurements and angles, distances between charges, weight of powder, the phrases of a man who liked numbers because they could be made to obey. Near the end, though, tucked between paragraphs, I saw it. On an unrelated note, you mentioned Mrs. Harrow's distress at the noises in the gorge. As I said in your home, there is no cause for fear. I would, however, be interested in observing the phenomenon more systematically. If you will permit, I should like to ride out some evening with my notebook and perhaps an instrument or two, assuming I can obtain one suitable. Sound, after all, is merely vibration. That which we can measure, we can sooner master. Trusting the Almighty will continue to bless our labors, yours in reason, W.J. Fenwick, M.D. I could almost hear him saying hours. Hours to tame, hours to carve, hours to silence. Underneath in the margin, someone, Margaret again, I suspected, had penciled a single word, hubris. The rest of that winter moved in fits and starts through her diary. February 22. 2 more injuries, a broken arm, a dislocated shoulder. Ezekiel says such things are to be expected in work of this nature. I suppose one does not widen a gorge without breaking a few bones. March 1. The sound was absent for 3 days. The silence was worse. March 5. We buried Charity Mullins today. Her mother cut a lock of her hair with such shaking hands that Agnes had to finish the job for her. The coffin seemed obscenely small. Fenwick rode out, as promised, with some device in his saddlebag, a brass tube and a set of tuning forks. He stood on the lip of the gorge as the evening wind rose, striking the forks and holding them up as if in challenge, his notebook open. Even after all this, when the howling began, he smiled. I do not think I like him. As winter turned to spring in 1884 in the diary, the entries grew less frequent but more strained. Brief notations of the work continuing, of incidents, of arguments overheard between Ezekiel and the commissioners. Then, in early May, the handwriting changed. The date at the top read, May 12, 1884. I recognized the slant of the letters, but the force behind them was different. Today, my son died. The sentence sat by itself in the middle of the page, stark. I felt my throat tighten. I'd processed enough family papers to know that moment when the diarist drops the pretense of narrative and just says it. It was like watching someone strip off a bandage. I forced myself to keep reading. It was not the gorge that took him. Not directly. Not in the way it has taken others. Perhaps that is what makes this worse. Thomas had insisted for weeks that he was not afraid of the sound. Was 7 years old. Fear is a thing boys of that age hate to admit. He told me it was just the wind shouting at us and that he could shout louder. Today, while I was in town seeing to Mama's rheumatism medicine, he slipped away from Agnes, who was mending in the parlor. He took the path through the pines to the old quarry pond, the one Dr. Fenwick insists is no more dangerous than any watering hole. He walked out onto the log they have always walked on, though I have told them not to. He slipped. By the time Agnes realized he was gone and the men found him, he had been in the water too long. They say children sometimes startle and inhale when cold water shocks them. They say it does not take much. His skin was so pale when they laid him on the kitchen table that for a moment I thought he had turned entirely to marble. Fenwick came, pumped his chest, breathed into his mouth, muttered words about new methods from Philadelphia. They did no good. His eyes never opened. He was 3 months past his 7th birthday, not 17, not some age of legend, just 7. I watched the tide of that grief come up off the page and wash over my desk in 1984. For a few seconds the processing room seemed to tilt. I closed my eyes, leaned back in my metal chair, and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. You're not in it, I told myself. You're just reading. It already happened 100 years ago. Your job is to make sure nobody forgets, not to feel it like it's your own. It didn't help much. When I looked again, the next day's entry was shorter. May 13, 1884. Ezekiel has forbidden me to write that Thomas was taken by the gorge. Superstition, he says. Men will talk, they will say the land is cursed. They will use our boy's death as an excuse to shirk work we cannot afford to leave undone. But I know what I heard. Last night as we laid Thomas out in his small coffin, the sound began from the gorge. It was softer than before, lower, almost satisfied. I do not know how a sound can be satisfied, but it was. The hair rose on the back of my neck. Outside in the parking lot beyond the cinder-block walls, a truck drove by, bass thumping faintly. The ordinary noise helped. I turned to the bottom of Box 1's inventory. County Coroner's Inquest Harrow vs. Commonwealth, 1885 copy. The file was a sheaf of onion skin paper, the type faint in places where the ribbon had been too dry. Inquest into DEATHS occurring AT Willow Gorge Road Improvement Site, held AT County Courthouse, Sept. 25/1885 presiding, Coroner Amos Kellner-esque. The inquest had been convened after what the inventory called the disaster. I flipped ahead, searching for that word. Testimony of Sheriff Daniel Fry, Q. Describe what you saw upon arrival at the scene on August 29. Rocks, sir. A hell of a lot of rocks. Beggin' your pardon. The whole side of the gorge done come down. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The road was gone. Where it had been there was a pile of stone and dirt 20-30 feet high in places. Q. And the men. We pulled out what we could, sir. Some alive, most not. 15 at last count. Busted heads, crushed chests, I never seen nothing like it. Looked like the land just decided to swallow 'em. I skimmed further. Testimony of Dr. W. J. Fenwick, Q. In your expert opinion, doctor, what was the cause of the slide? In simple terms, sir, the rock gave way. Blasting had weakened certain strata. Recent heavy rain saturated the soil above. The combination proved too much. It is regrettable. My recommendations regarding the spacing and timing of charges were not adhered to in all instances. Q. Are you suggesting negligence on the part of the workmen? I am suggesting only that when men are eager to meet a deadline, they sometimes grow careless. Nature requires more respect than the county commissioners showed her. There it was. That little jab at the end. Nature, respect. I found Ezekiel's testimony. He stated under oath that all reasonable precautions had been taken, that the men had been warned, that the commissioners had pressed for haste, yes, but always within the bounds of common sense. When the coroner asked if he had any knowledge of unusual sounds emanating from the gorge prior to the disaster, there was a notation. Witness hesitated. A follow-up question. Q. Is it not true, Mr. Harrow, that several citizens have reported a howling or screaming from the gorge in the months leading up to the accident? A. People like to give names to things they don't understand, Mr. Kellner. The wind can be unsettling in a narrow place. If there was any noise, it was nothing unnatural. Q. And you do not believe the rock fall was any sort of omen? I believe rock falls when you strike it hard enough. Underneath in different ink, someone had penciled 2 words. He lies. I flipped the last page of the inquest. Verdict: accidental deaths due to rock slide precipitated by blasting operations. No criminal negligence found. Recommendations: suspension of further work pending thorough study of the gorge. Attached in the back of the file was a clipping from the Gazette. Work HALTDAT Gorge County to seek alternate route in the margin. Parker's uncle or father had added a note for the inventory in a modern blue ballpoint. This is where the official story stops. Road closed, land left alone. But the family says the gorge kept screaming and the deaths kept coming. I sat back. The fluorescent light above me hummed steadily. Behind the hum, for just a second, I thought I heard something else. A long, low sound too deep to be the air conditioner. Not a heater kicking on, not the dehumidifier's drone. Like a truck on the highway, I told myself, or a train on the tracks 3 blocks away. It had the same odd shape as a memory, half there, half not. I rubbed my temples. Take a break, Walsh, I muttered. You're starting to jump at the ventilation. I reboxed what I'd taken out, sliding the folders back in the same order. Diary, ledger, letters, clipping file, inquest. Each piece a bone in the skeleton of 1884. As I lowered the lid, my eye caught on the last item listed in Box 1's inventory. Small journal unlabeled Barn Loft, 1885. I hadn't gotten to that yet. The journal was tucked down the side of the carton, half hidden between a stack of funeral cards and the photograph album, smaller even than Margaret's diary. The cover was cheap pasteboard, stained darker in one corner like it had gotten wet at some point. No name on the front. No date on the first page, only a shaky line of writing. Pa says not to write this down, but I don't know where else to put it. The handwriting was clumsy, skipping lines, spelling sliding around. A teenager, I guessed, or someone with little schooling. I turned the page. They say the gorge is quiet now. Folks in town tell each other the blasting scared it into silence, or that the Lord took pity and stitched its mouth shut with that rock slide. They're liars. I've been out there 3 nights running. Slipped past Ma when she fell asleep in her rocker, took Tom's old lantern and walked up the deer path. The first night it was just me and the trees and the water in the creek down below. I sat on the same big rock we used to sit on before everything went bad and listened. For a while, nothing. Then I heard it, not loud, not like before, like it was tired or far away, a sort of low moan way back in the throat of it. It made my teeth ache. The second night I went farther. Climbed down past the old surveyor's mark to where the air gets colder. Ma would skin me if she knew. Pa would too, though he ain't looked me in the eye since Nathan died. Tonight I went all the way to the new fall. It don't look natural. Rock piled up where it weren't piled before. Trees shoved sideways. There's a crack in the face of it big enough to crawl into if you're small. I ain't that stupid. But I put my hand on the stone and it felt warm. It shouldn't be warm, not at night, not when the air's cold enough to see your breath. When I pulled my hand back, my palm was shaking. I thought I heard something on the other side of that crack. Not wind. Something like a person trying to talk with their mouth full of dirt. I slammed the book closed before I even realized I'd stopped reading. My own palms were damp. I sat there, heartbeat thudding, in a cinder-block room in 1984, surrounded by acid-free boxes and the faint smell of fresh toner from the copy machine in the hallway. My rational mind told me exactly what was happening. I was tired. I'd read 2 days' worth of accounts of people dying in terrible ways. The human brain is built to mirror what it pays close attention to. I'd primed mine to hear screaming and any long, low noise. I picked the journal back up, flipped ahead. The entries grew more erratic. A line here about Ma hearin' Nate whistlin' out back even though he'd been dead 3 months. Another about Pa sayin' at supper the land took what it wanted and we best leave it be. And then, April 17, 1885, saw Ezekiel Harrow in town today. He looked old. Older than Pa, though he's only, 45. He don't walk right no more. Favors his left leg. Folks say he got hit by fallin' rock helpin' pull men out after the slide. He looked right at me when I passed him on the street. For a second I swear his eyes weren't his. They looked hollow, like something was looking out from behind him, something that weren't human. He said, "You stay away from that Gorge, boy." I said, "Yes, sir." Then he grabbed my arm hard. "Promise me," he said, "promise you won't go listening." His fingers hurt. "He ain't as weak as he looks." I said, all right, Mr. Harrow." He let me go. Walked off mutterin' about my fault and we opened it. I don't know what he meant. I do know this, the sound came again last night. And when it did for the first time, I thought I heard my name in it. I shut the little journal and set it gently back in the box. Outside, somewhere beyond the square of sky I couldn't see, Harrow, my own town, went about its Monday routines. Kids in keds and backpacks, pickup trucks with ladders in the back, the smell of fried chicken from the deli 2 blocks over. Regular life. In here the Gorge screamed quietly on, paper thin but sharp. I looked down at the box label again. Willow Gorge Archive 1884-1909. Underneath, the faint, half-faded pencil note, "Do not open." Nathaniel Parker had ignored that and brought the boxes here. I'd ignored it and cut the string. 100 years of darkness in one family had just started to unspool on my table, and I had 2 more boxes to go.